So the story is told about a woman who was traveling in New England, and there was an ice cream shop, and she went in to buy some ice cream, and amazingly, she was shocked to see Paul Newman. Does anyone, do you know who Paul Newman is? Paul Newman with his just beautiful blue eyes, and he was sitting at the counter and he was enjoying a bowl of ice cream. And she was just starstruck and amazed because she'd never seen a celebrity firsthand. So she ordered her ice cream, and she received her ice cream, and she paid for the ice cream, and she went out into the parking lot and sat down in the car seat, and then she said, "I forgot my ice cream." So she went back, and the clerk said, no, you took it. And Paul Newman turned to her and said, "It's in your purse." The shock of Easter is upon us. The shock of Easter. And I just wanted to remind you that if you're of the mindset that says, well, scientifically this cannot happen, people who are dead are not made alive again, all I can tell you is that I believe, and I believe I join a vast company of people down through the centuries who say that this unique event did in fact take place. Christianity has often been accused of promoting pie-in-the-sky escapism, right? Of being too heavenly minded to be any earthly good. Christianity has often been accused of being so fixated on the afterlife that often we treat this life as if it were just a stale Easter egg from last year that we forgot about, and it starts to stink in the couch. Right? Yeah. Critics of Christianity claim that we live in a throwaway society, and one of the reasons is that Christianity has promoted an attitude that says we should just use up this life because we're going to something better when we die. There's a vacation coming, right, with the angels in heaven. And that criticism, I guess, is valid to a point, and that point is Matthew 28. The bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Let me put today's essential elements as starkly as I can. Matthew 28 is a record of events that include this. Women, Mary and the other Mary, women, the most vulnerable of a patriarchal society, who do not give up, who in terrible sadness and depression nevertheless go to the tomb. They go there expecting to find a corpse. They go there expecting to find the vast rock of materiality, right? Things that cannot be easily moved. And what these women encounter is a vacant tomb. Something is empty. And then they have an experience in which information, right, is conveyed to them, namely that Jesus hasn't drifted away into heaven, but he goes ahead of them. Where? To Galilee. To a place. To a physical place. As if to say, I'm not escaping, I'm not leaving, I'm re-entering, right? This physical world of blood, sweat, and tears. And as they're walking away or running away with their hair seemingly on fire, they experience the reanimated body of Jesus of Nazareth, and he speaks with his lips and his tongue, and he says to them, hello, right? Or in popular jargon, what's up? Greetings. And then he follows that up with, do not be afraid. Now I want you to notice what's not present in this account. What is not present is a disembodied ghost of Jesus. Jesus does not appear as this vapor, right? As this vague memory, right? As this hallucination, not according to the text. And there is no promise here of a trip to heaven when we die. What he promises is back into the world, back to Galilee. In E. Annie Pruitt's novel, The Shipping News, there is an exciting event, a wake. A pillar of the community named Jack Budget, and this is in Newfoundland, he's drowned in a terrible accident. He's a lobsterman, and they were out trying to catch lobster, and he threw a trap into the ocean, and the rope got caught around his neck, and the rope pulled him into the frigid water. And by all counts, he drowned. And the townspeople go and they fish out his waterlogged corpse, and everyone is shocked and amazed, and they begin to adjust to the fact that this pillar of the community is dead. But they decide to celebrate his life, and they're going to have a wake in which everyone kind of gets drunk and sings songs about his life and so forth. And they dress him up in his best suit, and there he is in the coffin. But one of Jack's family members says, Jack would never want to be buried without his lodge pin, right? He was a member of this local lodge, right? This Moose Lodge, right? And he loved those people, and he loved that sense of community. He loved that pin. He would never want to be buried without his Moose Lodge pin. And so they go and they get this pin, and they affix it to the dead corpse's suit lapel, and as they're putting it onto his lapel, suddenly the corpse begins to cough up the waters of the deep, and Jack sits up in his coffin. This is no resurrection. This is explained later, right, as the frigid temperature, right, sent his body into a state of hypothermia and then a coma, right? He was virtually kind of frozen in this living state, and when they pressed on his chest with a lapel pin, they squeezed out the seawater, and he revived and became as healthy as ever. But what's fascinating about this story is that there are little children there, right? And they're thinking, you know, what's a wake? What's a wake, right? And when they see Jack wake up, they say, this truly is a wake, right? That's what happens, the shock of it. And Annie Pruitt writes, this is just an amazing paragraph. For if Jack Budget could escape from the pickle jar, right, when he was in his coma, he had this dream of being stuck in a pickle jar. Really interesting. For if Jack Budget could escape from the pickle jar, if a bird with a broken neck could fly away, what else might be possible? Water may be older than light. Diamonds crack in hot goat's blood. Mountaintops give off cold fire. Forests appear in mid-ocean. It may happen that a crab is caught with the shadow of a hand on its back, and that wind be imprisoned in a bit of a knotted string. And it may be that love sometimes occurs without pain or misery. It may be that love occurs without pain or misery. Here's what we're saying today. It may be that God's love becomes most real for us when we have exhausted every other possibility. It may be that God's passionate, deep, physical, emotional, psychological, emotional, grammatical, political love for us becomes the most real when the escape to heaven isn't good enough. As I mentioned to you back, one of the most important kind of events in my life is my dad, who passed away in 1996. And at the time, Cheryl and I were starting a new church, and I was just so busy, right, with all the different machinations of starting a new church, and we were advertising and doing all these things, that I didn't slow down to kind of just say, whoa, this is important. And a couple things happened. So he suffered a heart attack, and a paramedic jumped on his chest as they're taking him to the hospital and pounded him back to life, and he came back. And when my mom saw him, he said, this is, an automobile mechanic, gruff, kind of unbelieving guy. He said, I saw Jesus, right? And Jesus said, you're a child of Christ. And my mom said he was just so amazingly transformed, right? More like a child than he had ever been since she knew him. Through a series of complications, he ended up back in the hospital, and to make a long story short, he suffered some kind of aneurysm, and my brother and I were there kind of in the waiting room, and the nurse comes out and they say, he's bleeding, we have to make a decision, we do another surgery, or what? And I remember this brief conversation I had with my dad. He looked at me and he said, don't let me linger, right? This was a few days earlier. Don't let me linger. Like, of course not, Dad. I won't let you linger. Don't let me linger. So we looked up at the nurse, the doctor. I looked at my brother and I said, you've got to let him go. Now, you might say, in response to that scenario, he's in heaven, right? But let me tell you what I believe as a result of this story. I believe I'll see him again. I believe Jesus is the first of the dead ones, right? I believe in Christ, as a result of that, all those who are separated from us, we will experience again in some mysterious and profound way. My question for you is, do you believe it? Or are you here today because the flowers are growing, right? Because chocolate is sweet? Because the crumb cake tasted pretty good, right? I mean, all these things are good, but what is really shocking is the possibilities now. All right, then, I'll go to hell. This is how Huck Finn, in Mark Twain's classic story, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, arrives at his moment of resurrection hope. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Scott, Mark Twain was an atheist. He was an agnostic. He didn't like Christianity. Yes, but this is his moment of hope. When Huck Finn says, all right then, I'll go to hell. You remember the story? They're drifting down the old mighty Mississippi, and Huck Finn is with old Jim, right, this escaped slave. And on one of their stops, they disembark, and Huck sees this notice, this official-looking paper that says, we will pay a reward for those who turn in runaway slaves, right? And not only that, it kind of gives the impression that if you don't act, you're going to go to hell, right? Because this is wrong, right? This is property, right, that we're talking about, right? Some slave owner has lost his property. So Huck Finn gets back on the raft, and he decides what he's going to do. He's going to turn Jim in. And this is how Mark Twain writes it. I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I had ever felt so in my life. I knowed I could pray now, but I didn't do it straight off, but laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was all this had happened so, and how near I had come to being lost and going to hell. And I went on thinking, and I got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time, in the day and in the nighttime, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we floating along, talking and singing and laughing. But somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him. But only the other kind. I see him standing my watch over top, his instead of me, instead of calling me. So I could go on sleeping and see him how glad he was when I come back out of the fog. And when I come to him again in the swamp and up there where the feud was and such like times. And would always call me honey, and Jim would always pet me and do everything he could to think of me and how good he always was. And at last, I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard, and he was so grateful and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and I see that paper. It was a closed place. I took it up. I held it in my hand. I was a-trembling because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then I says to myself, all right then, I go to hell. And I tore the paper up. Now you might be wondering, what in the world does Huckleberry Finn have to do with Easter? And I say everything. Because if death is overturned, then all the corruption of the human cultures in which we live, that too is overturned. If death is overturned, then God is everywhere all the time. Psalm 139 says, if I make my bed in Sheol, if I make my bed in hell, you are there. 1 Peter 3:19 says, the resurrected Jesus made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, to the spirits in hell, which is to say, the possibilities are wide open now. And here's another one. If Jesus is resurrected in the body, it's possible that every time our lives have been twisted beyond recognition, it's possible there will be an untwisting. It's possible. Cheryl and I, when we first moved to Spokane back in the late 80s, we had a dog named Zacchaeus, and he was a Brittany, beautiful dog. We shouldn't have bought him because we were stupid and young, and we didn't know how to take care of a dog. He was a hunting dog, and he just loved to run. And he would get into neighbors' chicken coops and all kinds of crazy things. And so we raised him from a pup, and he would always run off, and invariably, right, he would come back, or we would chase him down. And one time he ran away from home. He was like 5 miles from home, right? But I always remember the time we came home and we had chained him up in the backyard. And he'd wrapped himself all around trees and bushes and rocks and everything. And we came home and I walked out the back door and he's jumping at me, right? And because the chain had shortened because it was wrapped around everything, he was kind of choking himself. And I was like, calm down, calm down, calm down. And instead of releasing him, right, because I was afraid he was going to run then, because that's what he did, I had to like lead him back around every tree, around every bush, around every rock, and then he was free. Maybe Easter might be a time for you to think about how God is untwisting from death, from sin, from every kind of brokenness, every kind of snag in your life. Happy Easter.